It was one of those evenings where the world outside felt like an afterthought. The sky had darkened early, casting a quiet mood over everything. I'd stayed late at the office, caught up in paperwork that never seemed to end. The thought of finally stepping into my home, shedding the weight of the day, and seeing my husband gave me a sense of calm. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Or so I thought. The moment I turned the key and pushed the door open, something felt off. There was music playing softly from the living room, jazz, his favorite, though he only put it on when he was trying to impress someone. The house smelled faintly of vanilla, which was strange because I hadn't lit that candle in weeks. I walked in slowly, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, my senses sharp. The quiet hum of voices reached my ears. Low murmurs, almost like a conversation, but too soft to make out. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter. Hers. Young, familiar, and wrong in every possible way. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat like a war drum inside my chest. When I reached the living room, I froze in place. There they were, him and her, locked in a kiss so unmistakably intimate that my mind almost refused to process it. Her arms were wrapped around his neck, her face turned upward in the glow of the dim lamp. And his hands rested on her waist as if she belonged there. It was my husband and my niece. A sound escaped me before I even realized it. Somewhere between a scream and a gasp, it felt ripped from my soul. I wasn't even aware of how loud it was until they jumped apart like they'd been burned. She stumbled back, wide-eyed, her lipstick smeared. He just stood there, his face drained of color, like a man who'd been caught in the middle of a burning building. For a long moment, none of us spoke. My vision swam. My legs felt weak, like they could give out any second. But instead of collapsing, I surged forward, not out of grace, but out of raw, unstoppable fury. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't even sure I was breathing. My purse hit the floor with a thud, but I didn't care. What is this? My voice came out strangled, half hysterical. It wasn't really a question. It was a demand for reality to correct itself, to make this scene dissolve into nothing more than a nightmare. Why? He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He looked helpless, like a man watching everything he'd built crumble in real time. And then my niece, a girl I'd practically helped raise, backed away, muttering something I didn't catch. Her eyes were filled with shame, but she didn't stay long enough to explain herself. She grabbed her coat and fled, leaving us alone in the wreckage. I turned to him, fists clenched at my sides, fury and disbelief swirling like a storm inside me. I didn't care about my niece in that moment. This was about him. My husband. The man who swore he'd be faithful, who promised me a lifetime of trust. And he'd thrown it all away for what? I couldn't wrap my head around it. You disgust me. The words flew out before I could stop them, but they felt weak compared to the hurricane brewing inside me. The man I thought I knew couldn't even meet my eyes. He pressed a hand to his face and dragged it down slowly, like he was trying to wake himself up. I'm sorry, he whispered. But it wasn't enough, not even close. I didn't want an apology. I wanted answers. Real ones. And no matter what, I would get them. That I stood there, arms crossed like a barrier against the tidal wave of rage and disbelief threatening to break me. He reached out, but I stepped back as though his touch might burn through my skin. Don't, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Don't you dare. I was trembling now, not from fear, but from the sheer force of trying to hold myself together. I want to know why. And don't you dare feed me some pathetic excuse. He exhaled shakily and ran a hand through his hair. It wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered, almost to himself. It wasn't like that. I laughed then, a cold, bitter sound that didn't belong to me. Wasn't like what, exactly? Because from where I stood, it looked exactly like betrayal. He slumped into the armchair, the same one where he used to sit with a book in his hands and a quiet smile on his face. But now, he looked like a man sentenced to death, waiting for the final blow. I don't know how to explain it. Then try. The word flew out of me, jagged and raw. You owe me something after that. I pointed to where they'd been standing, as though the image of their betrayal was burned into the floorboards. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his shame palpable. It wasn't about love or feelings, he said finally. It wasn't even about her. It was... He trailed off, eyes glassy as though searching for words in the wreckage of his own mistakes. It was about feeling like I wasn't enough, like I was losing something, or maybe I was just broken. Broken? I repeated, incredulous. You think you're the one who's broken here? I took a step closer, glaring down at him. You didn't trip and fall into this. You made a choice. You chose to betray me, with my own niece, no less. The mention of her sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. She wasn't some random stranger. She was blood. Family. I'd watched her grow up, given her advice, comforted her during breakups. She had keys to our house. She had access to our lives. And she'd used that access to destroy everything. I sat down on the couch, not because I wanted to, but because my legs felt like they might give out any second. The silence between us stretched so long it felt suffocating. Finally, I spoke again, my voice low but trembling with the weight of everything I couldn't put into words. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I trusted you. And you? I shook my head, unable to finish the thought. Was it just one time? Tell me the truth. Was this ongoing? He hesitated, just for a second, but that pause was enough to send my heart plummeting. I felt like I was bracing for impact, knowing the crash was inevitable. It was only a few times, he admitted, voice hoarse. But it wasn't, it didn't mean anything. The way he said it made me feel like screaming. Nothing? You tore our life apart for nothing. I leaned forward, fixing him with a glare that felt hot enough to scorch. That's the worst part, isn't it? You didn't even care about her. You just cared about, what? Feeling important? Feeling noticed? At my expense. His eyes were rimmed red, full of a pain that I wasn't sure if I pitied or hated. I've been a fool, he whispered. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I didn't realize how far gone I was until it was too late. I wanted to believe he was remorseful. I could see that he was. But remorse wasn't a time machine. It couldn't undo what I'd seen, couldn't erase the image of their kiss from my mind. And yet, even in my rage, I felt a small, nagging question rising from the ashes. How did this even begin? I'd been blind, or maybe I hadn't wanted to see. Either way, the truth was out, and I wasn't about to let this story end without understanding every ugly piece of it. I need to know everything, I said finally, staring him down. Every detail, every lie, every time you looked me in the eyes and pretended everything was fine. If you want any hope of fixing this, start talking. He looked up at me with hollow eyes, as though the telling would break him further. But I didn't care. I was owed the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And I wasn't stopping until I had it. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a few minutes. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of what he was about to confess could crush him. But I wasn't going to make it easy. I sat there, arms crossed, eyes unblinking, daring him to lie to me again. He let out a long breath and nodded, as if resigning himself to the inevitable. It started a few months ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Your niece, had come over a lot. I didn't think much of it at first. She was having trouble at home, arguing with her mom, feeling misunderstood. You know how she is, emotional, impulsive. I did know. She'd always been that way. But I didn't say anything. I let him keep digging his grave. She was here one evening while you were working late. We were in the kitchen just talking. I swear, in the beginning, it was innocent. I thought I was being kind, giving her someone to vent to. I felt my jaw tighten. And then what? You consoled her a little too much? He winced at the sarcasm, but didn't fight it. She hugged me. I should have pulled away. I knew even then that it wasn't right. But I didn't. There it was. The first choice, the moment where everything could have stopped before it even started. But he hadn't stopped it. I felt a chill spread through my chest as if my heart was frosting over. After that, I convinced myself it was a fluke, he continued. She left, and I told myself it was over. But she kept coming back. And he rubbed his temples, looking like he wished he could claw the memory out of his own mind. She started flirting, saying things that caught me off guard. I laughed it off at first, but she was persistent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're the adult," I said, my voice sharp with disbelief. "She was a kid playing with matches, and you let her set fire to everything?" His head dropped into his hands again. "You're right. I should have stopped it. But I don't know, lost." I wasn't thinking straight. And the truth is, for a few stupid moments, I let myself feel flattered by it. She made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Invisible. That word hit me like a slap. I felt the sting travel from my face to my chest. Invisible. I repeated bitterly. I didn't know I was married to a ghost. "You're telling me you burned down our life because you wanted someone to notice you?" He flinched. It sounds pathetic when I say it out loud. I didn't realize how fragile I'd become. How lonely I felt. That word, lonely, hung in the air like smoke. I hated that it rang true in a way I wasn't ready to admit. We'd both been so wrapped up in our separate worlds. I'd spent long nights at the office, taking extra projects to save up for the future, thinking he understood the sacrifices. But maybe he'd been unraveling while I wasn't looking, but still, that didn't justify this. It didn't make betrayal acceptable. "Why hers?" I asked, quieter this time, though the venom was still there. Of all people, why did it have to be hers? His hands dropped to his lap, and he shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. I wish I had some logical answer. Maybe it was because she was close, familiar. She was already in our world. It was easy. Too easy." I felt something inside me break a little more at that. Easy. That's what it had boiled down to. It wasn't about passion or love. It was about convenience. Like I'd been replaced for something more accessible. I leaned back, pressing my hands against my knees to keep myself steady. My anger wasn't gone. It never would be, but I could feel it shifting into something else. A terrible, aching understanding of how everything had fallen apart. "You threw away years of marriage for something meaningless," I muttered, staring at the carpet. "How do you even live with yourself?" He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, looking more broken than I'd ever seen him. "I don't," he said after a long silence. "Every time I look at you, I hate myself more. I wanted to tell you before you found out like this, but I was too much of a coward. I knew, once you knew, everything would be over. The thing was, he was wrong. It wasn't over. Not yet." I wasn't sure what over even looked like. All I knew was that I was standing in the rubble of what our life had been, and I still didn't have a way out. I wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. Not before I understood every last detail. "You still haven't told me everything," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. "What happened the last time?" "The night I walked in." He swallowed hard, his face pale. Whatever came next, I knew it would be worse than everything I'd already heard. But I wasn't backing down. I needed to know how far the betrayal had gone. And no matter how much it hurt, I was going to make him say it all. He stared at me like a man cornered, trapped in a room with no exits. I waited, giving him no escape, no mercy. "Tell me," I said, my voice low but unrelenting. "What happened that night? Why was she even here?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of his own truth. "She showed up unannounced," he began, his voice strained. "She said she needed to talk, that she felt alone." I closed my eyes for a second, biting back a scream. Alone. The same excuse again. When I opened them, he flinched at whatever he saw in my face. "She wasn't here for comfort," I said, venom dripping from every word. "She knew exactly what she was doing." He nodded slowly. "I know. I see that now. But that night, I was stupid enough to believe it. She said she felt like no one cared about her, and I let myself believe that I was helping her. But I wasn't helping anyone. I was just feeding my own weakness." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrest so hard I thought it might snap. "Get to the part where I walked in." He pressed his palms together, as if trying to hold himself steady. She started crying, saying how she felt like an outsider in her own family. I tried to. I don't know, calm her down. He shook his head, disgusted with himself. And then she kissed me. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay silent. I pushed her away at first, he continued, but she pulled me back. I was confused, and for a second I didn't stop her. That's when you walked in. I let his words sink in, each one a dagger to the gut. So, you're telling me it wasn't planned? That you weren't having an affair for months? He nodded quickly, like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. It wasn't like that. It was stupid, reckless, but it wasn't an affair in the way you're thinking. I laughed bitterly. Oh, right. A few stolen moments of betrayal are so much better than a full-blown affair. I stood up, pacing the room because sitting still felt impossible. You betrayed me, betrayed us, because she cried a little and told you a sob story? Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds? I do, he whispered. I know. You think I haven't replayed that moment 1,000 times in my head? I hate myself for it. I stopped and faced him, arms crossed. So what now? You think an apology and a few sad looks will fix this? You think you can erase what I saw? No. He looked up at me, eyes glistening. I don't. But I'd give anything to go back and undo it. I'd give anything to make you believe that I never wanted to hurt you. I felt a flicker of something then. Not forgiveness, not even sympathy, but the tiniest sliver of clarity. He wasn't the same man I thought I knew. Maybe he never had been. He'd shown me who he really was. Weak, desperate, and so easily swayed by something that should have never tempted him. But as much as I hated him, I wasn't sure I was ready to burn everything down just yet. This wasn't just about him, it was about me, too. I needed to know how far I could go, how strong I could be in the face of this disaster. You're going to tell me everything, I said again, slower this time. Not just what happened, but why. I want to know every thought, every choice that led to this. You owe me that much. He nodded again, looking exhausted, like a man on trial for his soul. I'll tell you everything. I promise. But promises meant nothing now. I wasn't listening to words anymore. I was watching his actions. And deep down, I knew that whatever came next would change everything for both of us. The room felt suffocating, thick with memories I couldn't escape from. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself as he shifted in a seat like a man waiting for a judge's final verdict. Go on, I said, though my voice felt distant, like it was coming from someone else. You say it wasn't an affair. So what was it? A temporary insanity. He hesitated, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to scrub the guilt away. I think it was a way to escape. His voice cracked, but I didn't flinch. I wanted the truth, even the parts that would haunt me. Escape from what? I asked, narrowing my eyes. From me? From us? He shook his head violently. No, from feeling like I didn't matter anymore. I told myself it was harmless, that she was just there, filling a void. But that's not an excuse. I know that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So what? You felt unimportant, and instead of talking to me, you threw yourself into her arms. It wasn't like that, he said quickly. It wasn't love, it wasn't lust, it was… I don't even know what it was. Convenient, I spat. That's what it was. He winced but didn't argue. Yes, he whispered. It was convenient. But it wasn't real. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and cold. Not real? Funny. It looked pretty real to me when her arms were around your neck. The memory seared through my mind again, making me feel like I was right back in that moment, standing frozen in shock while my world crumbled. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. This wasn't just some random girl. She's family. She's my blood. Do you know what you've destroyed? He looked up at me, eyes filled with regret. Everything, he said quietly. I know I destroyed everything. For a moment, I just stared at him, studying his face. This was the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd been by my side through every milestone, every struggle. But now, All I could see were the cracks, the fractures that had always been there but were invisible until now. You didn't just betray me, I said slowly. You betrayed us. And for what? To feel wanted? You think I don't get tired? You think I don't feel invisible sometimes? I shook my head, biting back the wave of anger threatening to rise again. But I didn't destroy you. I didn't turn to someone else the second I felt lonely. He stood then, but I held up a hand to stop him. Don't, I warned. You don't get to comfort me now. He sat back down, defeated. You're right. I don't deserve to. The silence between us was thick, oppressive. My mind raced with everything I still didn't understand. Did she ever love you? I asked, though the words felt like poison in my throat. He looked startled by the question, like it hadn't even occurred to him. No, he said firmly. She didn't. She was confused, lost. I was just someone who was there. I pressed my lips together to keep the tears at bay. I wasn't going to cry in front of him.
Not now.
And me? I asked, barely above a whisper. What am I? The woman you settled for? The one who works late, so she can hold this whole damn house together while you… My voice broke, but I forced myself to keep going. While you destroy it. He shook his head furiously.
No.
You're everything to me. I know I don't deserve you, but you've always been everything. I crossed my arms, watching him crumble, and for the first time, I realized something. He wasn't the only one who'd felt invisible. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking myself what I deserved. I'd accepted long nights, compromises, and sacrifices as part of the deal, thinking he'd understood. But maybe we'd both been blind. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said finally. But I know this. I'm not going to make any decisions tonight. You've torn our life apart, and I need to decide if I'm willing to stand in the rubble or walk away. He looked up at me, hope flickering in his eyes. I'll do whatever it takes, he whispered. Anything. Just don't give up on me yet. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to give him hope, not when I wasn't sure if there was any left for me. I turned and walked to the door, needing space to breathe. I heard him call my name softly, but I didn't turn back. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what came next, because no matter what he wanted, this was my choice now. And I wasn't going to let anyone else make it for me. I walked out onto the porch, letting the cold night air sting my face. The sky was a deep, bruised blue, and the stars were barely visible through the haze of city lights. I sucked in a breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. His words replayed in my head, each one like a splinter digging deeper. I thought of my niece, the girl I'd babysat, taken to school, and comforted when she cried over petty high school dramas. She had practically grown up in our house. I never once thought she'd be capable of something like this. But maybe I'd been too blind, too trusting. The betrayal felt layered, like every memory I had of her was suddenly poisoned. I leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the street. The neighborhood was quiet, with nothing but the hum of distant traffic. In the silence, the weight of it all started to sink in. What was I supposed to do now? Call my sister? Tell her what her daughter had done? Or should I keep this mess contained within the walls of my home? The front door creaked open behind me, and I knew without turning that it was him. He didn't speak right away, but I could feel his presence like a shadow. He was giving me space, but not enough. I wasn't ready to look at him again. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. I know you probably don't want to hear anything else from me, but there's something I need to say. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Is this where you confess something even worse? Because I don't think I can take another surprise tonight. He stepped closer, but I didn't move. No, he said softly. There's nothing worse than what I've already done. But I've been thinking, I think she did it to hurt you. Those words hit me like a punch. I turned to face him, my eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? He looked down, ashamed. Your niece.
I don't think it was about me.
I think she wanted to get back at you. The idea was absurd. Or, at least it should have been. But as I stood there, pieces of conversations and moments from the past started falling into place. I remembered the way she used to compare herself to me. How she'd joke about how I had it all. The job, the house, the husband. I'd always brushed it off as harmless jealousy, nothing serious. But what if it hadn't been harmless? I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at him. You're telling me she did this out of spite? And you were stupid enough to fall for it. He didn't try to defend himself. I don't know for sure. But looking back, the way she acted, the things she said, it's the only thing that makes sense. My hands tightened around the porch railing until my knuckles went white. I wanted to scream, to break something. The thought that she'd done this intentionally, to hurt me, was almost too much to bear. She's always wanted attention, I muttered, mostly to myself. But I never thought she'd go this far. Neither did I, he said quietly. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming wave of emotions threatening to pull me under. And you just let it happen. He didn't deny it. Yes, he admitted. I let it happen. I was weak, selfish. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I turned to face him, my anger simmering beneath the surface. You don't get to make this about your regret. You don't get to act like you're the victim here. I'm not, he said quickly. I know I'm not. I'm just trying to be honest. For once, I didn't know whether to believe him or not. But one thing was certain, if he was right, if my niece had done this to destroy me, then she wasn't just a girl who made a mistake. She was someone who wanted to see me suffer. And she'd succeeded. But the question still hung in the air. What do I do now? I had two choices. I could let this break me, let her win, or I could face it head on and take control of my life again. But I wasn't sure which path I was ready to take. Not yet did I stayed on the porch long after he went back inside. The chills sank into my skin, but I didn't move. My thoughts were a tangled mess of rage, disbelief, and something far more dangerous, purpose. If what he said was true, if she'd done this to tear me down, then I wasn't just a victim of a weak man's betrayal. I'd been hunted in my own home by someone I trusted. The realization hardened something inside me. Eventually, I stood and went back inside. He was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. He didn't say anything when I walked in, but I could feel his guilt hanging in the air like a fog. I ignored him and went straight to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and stared at the sink, willing myself to think clearly. I didn't want to fall apart. I wanted answers. Without a word, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her name. My thumb hovered over the call button. I hesitated, 1,000 questions buzzing in my mind like angry wasps. Was I ready to confront her? Could I handle hearing her voice, knowing what she'd done? But I pressed the button anyway. The phone rang once, twice, and then she picked up. Hello. Her voice was soft, almost innocent, and it made my blood boil. I forced myself to stay calm. We need to talk, I said coldly. There was a long pause on her end. Auntie? Don't. I cut her off. I don't want your excuses. You're coming over.
Tonight.
Another pause. Then, barely a whisper, okay. I hung up before she could say anything else. When I turned around, he was watching me with wary eyes. You called her? I nodded. She's coming over. His face paled. Do you really think that's a good idea? I don't care if it's a good idea, I snapped. I want the truth. And I want her to say it to my face. He opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He just nodded and stayed silent. The next 30 minutes felt like hours. I paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few seconds. My heart was racing, but I didn't let myself second-guess the confrontation that was about to happen. When the doorbell finally rang, I froze for a second before forcing myself to move. I opened the door, and there she was, my niece, standing on the porch with her eyes downcast and her hands shoved into the pockets of her coat. She looked so young, so fragile, but I knew better now. I stepped aside, letting her in without a word. She walked in slowly, as if she was afraid of what waited for her. I closed the door behind her, and the sound seemed to echo through the house. She stood in the middle of the living room, avoiding my eyes. He stayed seated on the couch, his head lowered like he couldn't bear to look at either of us. Why? I asked, my voice sharp but steady. She flinched but didn't look up.
I
don't know. Not good enough, I said, stepping closer. Why did you do it? What did I ever do to deserve this? Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw tears forming. But I wasn't moved. I'd cried enough already. I wasn't wasting more tears on her. You had everything, she whispered. You were perfect, your job, your house, your life. And every time I came here, I felt like I'd never be good enough. You didn't even mean to make me feel that way, but you did. I was tired of being in your shadow.
Her words hit me like a slap.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, you decided to destroy me? To take my husband? My voice trembled with fury. She shook her head quickly.
No.
I didn't plan it, at least not at first. But when he didn't stop me, her voice cracked, and she started to cry. I was angry and I wanted to hurt you. I felt something in me snap. All this pain, all this destruction, because of her petty jealousy? You wanted to hurt me, I repeated, my voice low but deadly. Well, congratulations. You did. But you've also ruined your life. And his. And mine. For what? So you could feel powerful for 5 minutes? Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to comfort her. I wasn't going to forgive her. I took a step back, letting the weight of my words settle. I gave you everything. And you destroyed it. You're not welcome here anymore. She looked up at me, her face pale and desperate. Please, get out, I said firmly. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked to the door. She paused once, as if she was waiting for me to call her back. I didn't. I stood there, cold and unmoving, until she opened the door and stepped out into the night. When the door closed behind her, I let out a shaky breath. He was still sitting there, staring at the floor. I'm sorry, he whispered. I turned to him, feeling hollow. Sorry isn't enough. He nodded slowly, knowing I was right. I need time, I said finally, to figure out what's left of my life, and if there's even a place for you in it.
He didn't argue.
He just nodded again, like a man waiting to be sentenced. I grabbed my coat and keys. I needed to be somewhere, anywhere but here. I needed to remind myself that I was still standing, still breathing. As I opened the door, I turned back to look at him one last time. You can stay tonight. But tomorrow? I want you gone. His face crumpled, but he didn't protest. I walked out into the cold night, letting the wind carry away the last remnants of my old life. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to be anyone's victim anymore. The cold air bit at my skin as I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, my mind racing. The headlights blurred in my vision, and I had to blink a few times to keep my focus. I pulled into an empty parking lot by a small park and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening after everything that had happened. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, replaying every word, every moment. My niece's jealousy, his weakness, their betrayal. It was all tangled together in a mess I hadn't asked for, but now had to clean up. I wasn't sure how long I stayed there, staring into the dark, but eventually I knew I couldn't avoid what came next. My life didn't end tonight. It had been broken, yes, but not destroyed. I was still here. And as long as I was standing, I could rebuild. By the time I got back home, the house was quiet. The front porch light was still on, and I realized he'd left it on for me. I almost wanted to laugh at how ridiculous that small kindness felt after everything. I walked in, shut the door behind me, and locked it. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of water in front of him. He looked up when he heard me, but I held up a hand.
Don't, I said.
Just don't. He nodded, his face weary and defeated. I packed a bag, he said softly. I'll leave first thing in the morning. I walked past him and sat across the room, watching him from a distance. I wanted to feel satisfaction in seeing him like this, broken, unsure. But I didn't. There was no victory in this. Only loss. You should have been stronger, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But you weren't. And I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for that. He didn't look up. I don't expect you to. We sat in silence, the kind that felt final. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. I was too tired to pick apart the past any longer. I stood up slowly. I'm going to bed, And tomorrow, when I wake up, I want you gone. No goodbyes, no lingering. He nodded, his eyes glistening. I understand. I turned and walked away, closing the bedroom door behind me. I leaned against it, the tears I'd been holding in finally spilling over. I let myself cry, not because I was weak, but because I needed to let it all out. The grief, the rage, the exhaustion. When I finally crawled into bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the emptiness settle around me. It was over, at least this chapter of it. The next morning, when I came downstairs, the house was empty. His shoes weren't by the door. His bag was gone. And for the first time in years, the house felt unnervingly quiet. I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was still mine. And maybe that was enough for now. A text buzzed on my phone. It was from my sister, my niece's mother. She told me everything.
I don't know what to say.
I'm so sorry. I stared at the message, feeling strangely detached. I typed back a single response. I don't want to talk about it.
I didn't need sympathy.
I didn't need apologies from anyone else. I just needed to find myself again piece by piece. The next few days passed in a blur. I went back to work, filled my days with tasks that kept me from thinking too much. I avoided calls and messages from anyone who knew what had happened. Then one night, a knock on the door startled me. When I opened it, my husband was standing there, his face gaunt, his eyes desperate. I know you told me to stay away, he began, his voice raw. But I couldn't leave it like this. I need to tell you one more thing. I didn't step aside. I crossed my arms and stared at him. You're wasting your breath. He swallowed hard. I know I don't deserve another chance. But I still love you. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that if you let me. My heart ached, but I kept my face blank.
Love isn't enough, I said.
Not after what you did. He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of my words. I know. He paused, then added, but if you ever change your mind, I'll be here. I closed the door without another word and locked it. I didn't know if I'd ever change my mind. Maybe I'd never forgive him. Or maybe one day, I'd wake up and realize that forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about me. But that day wasn't today. Today, I chose myself. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that choice felt like enough.